Hello everyone and welcome! In today's video, I'm going to be building a 1/24 scale RC replica of the 1980 Dodge Ramcharger SUV. Super scale realism isn't just reserved for the larger 1/10 scale rigs. This little Ramcharger features some great details, including an interior, well-detailed and true 1/24 scale body, and of course plenty of tricolor decals. As a bit of a change of pace, this project does not require any 3D printed parts. I also managed to spend less than $100 building this Ramcharger. Hopefully this build will show that you don't need a huge amount of cash to do a really cool scale truck build, nor is it especially challenging, so this is definitely something I think a lot of you watching might want to try for yourself. I'll be covering every step of the build in this video, from the unboxing to driving. In the end, this Ramcharger will not only look cool, but it will be fully functional and ready to conquer the off-road trails. Well, just as long as they're the right scale. The Dodge Ramcharger was a full-size SUV based on a shortened D-Series pickup chassis and was intended to compete primarily with the Chevy K5 Blazer and GMC Jimmy, as well as the later F-Series based Ford Broncos. 1980 was the final year for what's considered the first generation for the Ramcharger and was the final year to feature a removable top. There's just something so cool about these early SUVs from the late 60s and 70s, and while the Ramcharger and the nearly identical Plymouth Trail Duster might get a little overshadowed by the Bronco and Blazer, I think they're every bit as cool and a great body to use for this project. While the 1980 Ramcharger body I'll be using for this build came from this Revell model kit, which I picked up secondhand for pretty cheap a while back, maybe like 10 or 15 bucks, I've since noticed that this kit can be a little hard to find for a reasonable price online. With this in mind, I tried to find a more current, lower-priced SUV model kit as a possible alternative, but everything that I saw was too small, with the wheelbase far less than the chassis' minimum adjustable length, and the width of these bodies would have the wheels sitting far outside of the fenders. I'm sure there's some stuff out there that would work, but I wanted to point this out before I begin, so anyone interested in doing a similar build with this same model kit will be aware of this. You'll either need to shell out more money than I did getting one of these model kits, or try to score a deal like I was able to do. Again, I'm sure there's other model kits out there that would work, but all of the 70s and 80s Blazers and Bronco model kits that I was looking at, kind of similar older American SUVs, they just all seem to be a little bit too small. If there's sufficient interest in these types of micro but scale looking crawler builds, I can follow up this video with a similar build to the one that I have here, but with a more current and easy to find model kit. Just let me know if you'd like to see something like that in the comments below, and leave a like on this video. But with all of that said, let's move on to looking at the chassis. As cool as it would be to design and 3D print a custom chassis, as I've done for other small-scale builds, creating something easy to print, durable, and cost-effective was a challenge. It's because of this that I'm instead using this 1/24 scale RC 4-wheel drive Trailfinder 2 ready-to-run crawler as a base for my own custom build. This saves me a lot of time and effort, albeit with a few compromises. One of those being this truck isn't exactly great. I won't go into a ton of detail in this video, since previously I did a whole separate review on this RC 4-wheel drive Trailfinder 2, which I'll link below in the description, but in summary, the idea of having a super scale tiny tire micro crawler from a company as respected as RC 4-wheel drive was a great one. The execution, however, left a lot to be desired for many hobbyists, especially when compared to the strong offerings from other brands. The $170 price tag these trucks had at launch was another element that hobbyists criticized. Prices have since, however, gone down to less than half of that on a number of sites, as I was able to pick this truck up for less than $80 from Tower Hobbies. While some consider $80 still too much to spend on one of these trucks, in my opinion, I think for that price it's a fair platform for a custom scale model build despite its flaws. With the plastic model kit and this ready-to-run crawler being obtained for less than $100, and basically everything I need is included in these two packages, this should be a pretty cool build, especially for the price. While these 1/24 scale Trailfinder 2s can still be found for around $80, at least at the time of making this video, you better snag one up fast if you want one, as many retailers seem to be discontinuing and running short on stock. Now, I don't know any details, but it is kind of looking like this might be the end of the line for these little Trailfinder 2s, I'm really hoping RC 4-wheel drive will listen to what customers have said and come out with an updated and improved version of this crawler, but I guess time will tell. Inside the box, everything needed for this truck is included, as this is a completely ready-to-run model. Here I'll give you all a quick look at the truck, though again if you want a more detailed look at this 124 scale Trailfinder 2, check out my full review video. The unlicensed Toyota body that this truck comes with looks alright and certainly has potential, but I think the Ramcharger body is going to be an upgrade. The size and scale look of this chassis is great, and is probably the best ready-to-run option on the market right now for this type of model truck to RC conversion build, at least if you want to emphasize scale realism rather than off-road performance. It's no secret that the electronics that are included are not great, but they will get the job done. This one does have the upgraded N30 motor. I went ahead and put the batteries in just to make sure that the truck was working before I moved forward with the build. And with that done, the chassis is basically ready to go, so let's move on to the body. This is the model kit I chose for this build, the 124 scale 1980 Dodge Ramcharger from Revell. I picked this kit up secondhand, but it's all here. Well, at least I hope it is. We'll have a look at all of the parts included with this kit. While this kit is a re-release of a much older one, and like with most re-releases from Revell, it may lack some of the detail you'll find on many modern day kits, this is still a very nice kit overall with a lot of nice detail and of course a very accurate body. I also love the included tri-tone decals. As soon as I saw those, I knew I had to add them onto my build. Many of the parts that you see here will go unused, but could make great pieces for a diorama in the future. The body has been painted before, but that's no problem, as I'm just doing a relatively quick build, and I'm going for more of a driver quality truck rather than a shelf queen. The body looks good, and that's what's important. I knew that it would just barely fit this RC 4-wheel drive chassis, so that's why I chose it for this build. While this Trailfinder 2 is probably one of the smallest 124 scale chassis available, at least as a ready-to-run, it's still quite large relative to most 124th and 125th scale model kits, so body selection will be limited unless you're okay with the wheelbase and width of the chassis far surpassing where it would be from the factory. Fortunately though, with a little work, this Ramcharger body will just fit this chassis while still maintaining a, not stock, but sort of a milder custom look with regards to the ride height and wheelbase. I'm not going for anything too crazy looking with this build. The next step is to work on getting this Ramcharger body to fit over top of this RC chassis. So the only somewhat challenging part of this build is getting the body to fit on the chassis. Obviously, it's not going to fit properly without a little work, so I started out by adjusting the wheelbase on the chassis so it will be closer to where it needs to be to fit. This is very easy to do with the Trailfinder 2 chassis, as you can see. All that's needed is to relocate the rear suspension links and the upper spring mounts. The shortest wheelbase this chassis will do without further modifications is 115mm, which is just a little too long to perfectly fit this body, but it's close enough for me, so I'll continue on. To counteract that a bit, I'll enlarge the wheel arches on the body later on to help make the wheelbase look a little more correct, but right now I need to remove some material from under the hood so the body will sit low enough. Rather than just hack away at it all at once, I marked the areas to cut and gradually removed more material as needed, just in case there would be any possibility of having some kind of engine bay, but this really wasn't doable and I ended up removing most of the inner fenders and firewall. After getting the body to sit low enough, it was the interior tub's turn to meet the cutting wheel. I needed to make the interior pretty shallow to clear the chassis below and ensure there is plenty of room for the battery, but I guess some interior is better than none. With the cutting done, the building can begin, starting with gluing the dash into place. To create a new floor for this now shallower interior, I traced and cut out a piece of styrene that I could glue to the interior piece. I'll fix the rough edges later on after the glue dries. In the meantime, the next items to add are the seats and roll bar, which of course will need to be modified to fit the interior. You can see a bit of flash on these roll bar pieces, and even though this part won't be very visible on the finished truck, I still went ahead and cleaned up these parts a bit with a knife and some sanding. Little imperfections like this are no big deal as it's so easy to fix, and just taking a bit of time to do so will result in a better looking model in the end. I quickly cleaned up these lower edges. I'm not really concerned with making this edge look perfect as it really won't be seen, but a little work with the rotary tool cleans it up quite a bit. With that done, I worked on the seats. First gluing the two halves together and then cutting them down so they won't be too tall sitting in the interior. It's looking good, we'll just need to hope neither the driver or passengers are very tall. I'll set those interior parts aside for now until I'm ready to start painting. At this point, I'm ready to start assembling the body and mocking things up to see how well they fit. I realized that some material would need to be removed from the rear of the chassis. Fortunately, removing the ends of the frame rails turned out to be quite easy, as I could relocate this crossmember piece slightly more forward and then cut off the ends of the rails. In addition to shaving a little off the rear of the frame rails, I also removed as much material as I could from the front of the body so I could get it to sit as far back as possible. It certainly took some time to get everything lined up as best I could, and it's a bit of a tight squeeze, but the body is sitting about as well as I can make it on this chassis. Clearly though, some additional material was going to need to be removed from the wheel arches. I did my best not to remove too much material to try to retain a mostly stock appearance, but just a little bit of work makes everything look and fit a lot better. It took some patience, but this Ramcharger body has been successfully fitted to this Trailfinder 2 chassis. And not just slapped on top, but it really looks at home after making those mods. The wheels sit pretty well within the arches, and they don't stick out too far beyond the fenders. Later after painting, I'll use the extra set of Velcro included with the Trailfinder 2 to mount this body just like that yellow Toyota body was mounted. Now I can move on to painting and assembling this Ramcharger body. With the body now modified to fit this chassis, basically all that's left to do now is the fun stuff, which is painting and putting this body together. As I said before, this body has already been painted, so I sanded away some of that old paint and did my best to remove any imperfections. I'm by no means going for perfection with this build, but a little work can go a long way to get a better finished result. One thing that can help improve the final appearance is to deepen the panel gaps a bit, which is what I'm doing here. I also went ahead and glued the hood to the body, and I added a little spacer underneath, which is where the Velcro will go. With the tailgate in place, I went ahead and washed the body before painting it. Nothing fancy here with regards to the paint, just a few coats of Rust-Oleum Gloss White. While the body dries, I'll turn my attention to the interior. Despite the interior not being very visible, I still went ahead and sanded away a few imperfections prior to painting. I used some shoe goo to secure the seats to the interior piece, since I'll be painting them the same color. Just like with the body, I washed each of the parts before painting. I started by painting all of the black parts, including the roll bar, steering wheel, and the underside of the interior. Once that paint on the interior tub had dried, I painted the top side of it dark red. I thought the dark red interior would look cool with that white body, and it ended up turning out really nice. After letting that paint dry, I added a bit more detail with some Sharpie markers. I later realized that the model kit included some nice gauge decals, which I could have used, but regardless, just a little work with the markers helps add some more detail to this interior. I also did a quick wash over the seats just to darken them a bit. Now this is completely optional if you're doing a similar build, and while 3D printing is not required to do a build like this, I decided to quickly model a few accessories that I could 3D print and add to the interior just to fill some space and add a bit more detail. I designed a simple cooler, toolbox, and shovel, which I've posted onto Patreon for anyone who wants to print them at home. Link is in the description below. I decided to print them on a FDM printer since although they won't have as much detail or a nice smooth finish like they would if resin printed, FDM printing was much faster, and since these items won't be too visible, I figured this amount of detail was good enough. I gave them each a quick coat of paint, and then once again added some simple detail with the Sharpie markers and a bit of paint. They turned out looking really nice, so I added them to the rear of the interior. By this time the paint on the body was dry. While it's far from perfect, in part due to the prior paint job and some sanding scratches showing through, I really liked the look as it sort of had a subtle aged and scratched appearance, which looks pretty cool on this truck. Once again, I simply used some Sharpies to add detail to the body, starting with these lower trim pieces. Just like with the gauges for the interior, I didn't realize until later that some of these emblems and the lights have decals, so I ended up just using markers to add details to these spots, but later on I did apply those decals. At the same time, I added black to the intersections of the grille, and I also used a silver Sharpie around these outer sections, as I noticed that on the real grills, they aren't chrome all the way around, so I was able to somewhat recreate that look pretty well here. I also installed the 4 headlights after adding black around the outer edge of each. Next, I used masking tape and an airbrush to paint all of the window trim. After that, I applied all of the water slide decals, including those groovy tri-tone stripes, which look so good on this body. I did have some issues getting some of the decals to stick well, which resulted in a few challenges, and I ended up losing the Dodge emblem on the hood when spraying clear, but honestly, I just rolled with it as it seems most of the original decals and trim I see on real trucks from this era tend to show their age, at least a little bit, so it all worked out in the end. To hopefully keep these decals protected when handling and driving the truck, I applied a few coats of clear over top. While the clear dries, I worked on the spare tire rack, spare tire, and jerry can that will later be glued to the back of the body. These are a cool inclusion to the kit, which will help add some more detail to the back of this body. All I did was sand away a few minor imperfections, wash the parts, and sprayed on some paint. At the same time, I also sanded the edges of the windows and made sure they fit the body before washing them as well. I applied some tint film to the sunroof and rear windows. I wasn't going for high school parking lot Honda Civic levels of just total blackout, but rather a much more subtle, almost factory tint, which I find is easier to achieve with film rather than with paint. I'm sure there are other ways to get the same light, sort of bluish gray tint by using paint, but the film works pretty well overall. It's better to use a little heat and soapy water when putting these on, but overall I got a pretty good result just doing it quick and dirty. I did totally mess up the tint on the right side window. However, I figured with this being a 40-plus-year-old Dodge, some deteriorating AutoZone tint film might not look too out of place, so I just kept it as it is rather than redoing it. The adhesion on this film is not great, especially for smaller parts, but I found that pre-cutting the windows helps, since going around the edge afterwards with scissors or a knife tends to lift the film from the edges, and it doesn't always leave as clean of an edge. Probably not the best technique if you're going for absolute perfection, but if you've got this stuff lying around anyways, it might be worth giving it a try. Of course, after that, I glued those windows to the body along with the grille and bumpers. There were a few other window-related items I wanted to add, one of those being a rear view mirror, which unfortunately this kit does not include, but I have a generic one on hand. I also added a couple Make It RC decals to the front and rear. And one final detail was I used a little scrap piece of plastic to make the little latch thing that pops up the sunroof. Moving right along, I got out the chrome parts tree and added the taillights and side view mirrors, which will definitely not survive any kind of rollover. Just getting them to stay in place while gluing was a little tricky. One item that I had laying around from a prior build that you may remember was an extra USTE 2022 license plate I used for that 76 Chevy C10 build. I figured this would be as good of a build as any to put this plate on, since I'll be bringing this build to next year's Ultimate Scale Truck Expo down in Florida this upcoming February, so it will look right at home on the back of this Ramcharger after a bit of paint and detail. Speaking of detail, before installing these final items, I did a little final painting on the spare tire, jerry can, and inner fenders. Not concerned with perfection here, as none of these spots will be very visible, but it will still look good to have this little bit of extra detail. I glued all of the parts on the back into place, and with that done, the body is complete. Of course, with the body finished, the next thing to do was to glue the interior piece into place, and once that glue dried, I used the Velcro included with the Trail Finder 2 to mount the body to the chassis. And finally, with that done, the truck is now complete. I'm loving the look of this Ramcharger. The interior-exterior color combo, the stripes, the stance, it's just a cool looking truck all around. From the beginning, I wanted something old school looking, and this definitely has the look I was going for. It's certainly not cosmetically perfect, but for a quick and simple build that's going to get driven and enjoyed, it turned out pretty nice. Of course, all that's left to do now is get this out onto the trails. Performance, as anticipated, isn't great. I'm already well aware of this chassis' shortcomings, and putting a heavier and more top-heavy body on top doesn't exactly improve things. While the N30 motor in this truck is an improvement over the one that was in that Trailfinder 2 I reviewed prior, you still pretty much have to hit an obstacle with close to full throttle to get over top of it. Slow crawling isn't something this Trailfinder 2 is very good at, but while not the most lifelike truck to drive, it certainly still is fun. In the right environment, not only does this truck look pretty cool, but it will get over most of what lies in its path. A very cool little build, especially for what I have invested into it. I might tinker with the chassis a bit to make the thing drive a little more scale, but other than that, I hope this video provided you all with some ideas and inspiration for your own projects. I think the time spent early on modifying and tweaking the body and chassis really helps with the finished appearance of this truck. That Revell Ramcharger body looks right at home on top of this Trailfinder 2 chassis, without the wheels sticking too far out or the body sitting way too high off the chassis. This really is the look that I was going for. So with the model kit, and now apparently even the Trailfinder 2 chassis being out of production, as I said towards the beginning of this video, if you want me to do a similar microcrawler build to this, but maybe with a more current and easy to obtain model kit, let me know. I've thought about maybe doing a similar build to this, but on a more popular and capable platform like an SCX24, Even though it's not as scale looking as a Trailfinder 2, I thought there could still be some potential for a nice lifelike build, but let me know what you all think below in the comments. Before I wrap up this video, I do want to give a huge shout out to all of the channel members and Patreon supporters. It's their contributions that help make these videos possible, and for that I want to thank them all very much for their support. Links are below in the description if you want to join and get yourself access to some exclusive perks. All in all, a very fun build that I certainly enjoyed making, and I hope you all enjoyed watching. Lots more cool builds on the way, but until then, as always, I want to thank you all very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.